We are really happy to be with you today and want to welcome you. I guess we're taking a walk this afternoon, and that's been something that I know Chris and I have loved, the practice of walking in pilgrimage and loved sharing around that. So we're looking forward to inviting you into that kind of a conversation today. As we begin, though, we would love to begin by centering our hearts and minds and beginning in prayer. And so the Lord be with you.
And also with you.
Let us pray. Pilgrim God, you are our origin and destination. Travel with us, we pray, in every pilgrimage of faith and every journey of the heart. Give us the courage to set off, the nourishment we need to travel well, and the welcome we long for at journey's end. So we may grow in grace and love of you and in the service of others through Jesus Christ our Lord. I am Greg Foraker, and I was telling Kirsten and Chris just before we welcomed you into the room that pilgrimage has been a big part of my life for a number of years. Every supervisor or boss that I've had for the last 20 years has invited me, asked me, commanded me to lead a pilgrimage. And so it's interesting how vocation and ministry finds you. So I've had the gift of leading pilgrimages with young groups, older groups, I should say, ages, I think, 15 to 82 in a number of places, and have grown to love the art of pilgrimage, the spiritual practice, as something that allows us to go deep in our faith and with each other like almost no other spiritual practice. So I guess I've become quite committed to pilgrimage over the years. Chris?
Yeah, I'd like to say hi to everybody, and I am Chris Ditzenberger. I serve as the rector of St. Gabriel the Archangel in Cherry Hills. And as we were talking before we came on, Kirsten asked us both, how long have we been involved or had an interest in pilgrimage? And I say formally, I'd say about 2 years. So Greg has kind of been my mentor along the way. And yet I've also been a walker and a hiker all my life, having the privilege of growing up here in Colorado. And so, you know, the metaphor of a pilgrimage or a journey is something that's always resonated with me in our faith tradition. And so it was something that that I'll share that story a little bit here in our time together, but it does sit deeply in my soul. And I'm so glad that we have the opportunity here, you know, in our diocese to come together, partner, and explore this topic in ways that may be fruitful for us down the road. So I'm very excited to be with you all here today.
And welcome. I guess, Chris, as we get underway, I want to ask you a question just to start our conversation. And maybe we can have some back and forth around this. And that is, the first question that comes to mind, what is pilgrimage?
Yeah. Okay. So yeah, as we go through today, I want to get to that question, and I want to address that too. But let me just kind of step back a little bit here and just kind of share a little bit of format for today. We want it to be a conversation, and we'd love to take questions as they arise in your minds. You can do that by, I guess, going to the reactions button on the bottom of your Zoom call or top of your Zoom call, and just raise your hand. And then Kirsten will also help us field questions throughout the time that we have this conversation. So we want this to be open-ended conversation. And so we're going to be looking at really several things. Today, we're going to be looking at some core elements of pilgrimage. We want to be looking at some, and then spending some time in contemplation and breakout groups where we can just have a little bit more intimate conversation. And then we want to pledge our own collaboration with one another, that we, Scott and Greg and I, will be able to share learnings or just maybe field questions that may arise in the next couple months or down the road, something like that. So that's basically the overall format that we want to follow here today. So, Greg, you asked a great question. What is pilgrimage? And I guess there are probably, different definitions out there. But for me, the one that I've kind of come to is that it's kind of a journey of varying degrees of length, undertaken with intention to grow closer to God, and also to open oneself up to interpersonal exploration as well, in that relationship, not only with God, but also with one's world, relationships, and people around you, creation itself, or perhaps even, just that interior work that God wants to do in my own personal life, for example. So to me, the pilgrimage can also be something, I think, that has inclusive elements to it, in the sense that we can imagine ways to take this journey that does not necessarily mean we have to get on a plane and go to France and begin the Camino de Santiago from Saint Jean de Pied de Port, Greg, but we can actually, find ways that we can explore local walking, or perhaps if we don't have the ability or opportunity to do that, you and I've sort of talked about ways that we can see pilgrimage being something more interior, or even more local than just walking your neighborhood, walking, from your home to your mailbox to put a letter in the mail sometime. And we could talk a little bit more why we think that could be part of a definition of pilgrimage. I just want to also add that historically, as you kind of look at history, people have been going on pilgrimage for eons, generations of generations. Medieval Christianity found people walking to historic sites, going to Jerusalem, to walk in the feet of Jesus, literally, through the streets, through Galilee, through Jerusalem. The pilgrimage to Rome was another big one, the one to Santiago in Spain, and also in England, several other places like journeying to Walsingham to make a pilgrimage there. Or Canterbury. Everybody knows about the Canterbury Tales, which is all around the pilgrimage of those crazy pilgrims that Geoffrey Chaucer chronicled so well. And I suspect that many of us on the call today had to learn the prologue in Middle English. I won't try to massacre that for you all today. But so people went for a variety of reasons. Some went to ask a favor, to seek healing. Some went out of living out a sentence. Actually, I learned that was kind of something interesting to learn, that people were sent on pilgrimage as sort of an act of penance, and at the completion of that, they would be forgiven of their offense. Today, I think people go for lots and lots of reasons. People that I found when I was walking on the Camino last fall, really, some folks went out of a sense of life change and kind of reflecting on that, or a sense of exploring, vocational questions, or some people, kind of trying to find themselves, and, those kinds of things, seeking healing. So there's lots of things that kind of fall under a definition of pilgrimage. And we can explore some more of those later on. But Greg, do you have a particular definition that you like, or might be a tweak on what I've already said?
Well, I really love what you've said. There's a quote that I would share from John Pritchard that I think just kind of reaffirms what you've just said. To me, pilgrimage is one of the most ancient practices in every spiritual tradition. It gets at an archetypal need to go on a journey, to go to a place, to seek and perhaps touch something of the roots of the tradition or something that is particularly holy about a tradition. And so that's certainly true in our Christian journey. John Pritchard says this: for Christians and other believers, pilgrimage is a time to be with God in order to be more fully in life. So it's not apart from life. It reflects a miniature journey, in miniature, the journey we take with God from birth to death, and then on to the heavenly city. Pilgrimage is therefore an inward journey as well as an outward one, because it's different from normal life. Pilgrimage puts us somewhat off balance. It throws us, and therefore, perhaps we are more open to God. And I like Pritchard's comments, that sense of it being maybe a reflection of our whole life journey, that we're deciding to engage in a particular way of reflection. And I also appreciate the noticing that pilgrimage puts us off balance. It takes us out of our ordinary. It takes us away from our creature comforts, sometimes away from our language and customs, and really invites us to open up and rely more on God and with those around us in community. So
Yeah.
I'm curious, though, part of what he doesn't quite say is something you spoke of a little bit, and that is that sense of the why we step off in pilgrimage. And I wonder, I might call that intention. And I wonder, Chris, how you might respond to how we could approach intention around pilgrimage.
Yeah. So if you would just allow me to share a little bit about my own story, I think it might get at that question a little bit, Greg, that you asked. As I said earlier in my intro, I've been a lifelong hiker and walker. I really identify with this idea of journey and pilgrimage. And so I had an opportunity to plan a sabbatical last year, which allowed me this time and space to think about, where I'm at in my journey, where I'm at, and lots of questions came up there, and this was an opportunity to do something different from when I had done my first sabbatical, which was in 2012, and the opportunity then was more centered around studying in the library, writing some blog entries and doing a lot of reading, sharing, and for lots of different reasons. It was kind of local here in Greenwood Village. I really wasn't able to get terribly far from home, largely due to family considerations during that period when our kids were younger. So as this developed in me, this desire to do something different, I had heard about the pilgrimages that Greg had led, and was kind of intrigued. And so Greg and I sat down for a lunch and had a wonderful conversation that put so many thoughts in my head. And one of the things that you did, Greg, I think for me, was that you kind of raised some questions about intention, and how is it that we really put some thought into why are we wanting to do this? Why do we want to do a pilgrimage? And I think getting at that why is such a critical thing. And for me, it was fairly clear at the outset what I was trying to do, what I wanted to do, and yet sometimes, your intentions can sort of unfold over time as well. So for me, for instance, I kind of wanted to hone in on this particular verse from Jeremiah 6, which says, "Thus says the Lord, stand at the crossroads and look and ask for the ancient paths where the good way lies, and walk in it and find rest for your souls." So I was kind of seeking those ancient paths which I could connect with that might inform my current life. And I invited my wife CJ into that discussion as well. So that kind of got at, for me, sort of the why, to experience a kind of a different kind of spirituality, to reflect on vocation and life stage. Our kids were in the early 20s. CJ really wanted to revisit her own sense of vocation, and for me to take stock of being at St. Gabe's for 17 years, and also to kind of reflect on what does it look like post-COVID for us to continue together as church here in this place. So for me, those were some of the things that I kind of had in my mind as far as intentions. What was I doing this for? I can also see, though, that sometimes the intentions may not be clear at the outset. And in the very doing of pilgrimage, they also might change as well along the way. What you thought you were doing it for, kind of might change in a way. The actual doing it kind of changes you, as you've said many times, I think. And then I think for some people too, they're really unclear all the way through. Why did I do this? I really don't know. But then the opportunity for that question to be answered, I think, comes later on for them as they reflect back on that experience there. So I think one of the things that I've really appreciated, Greg, and I'm going to throw this back to you here about intention, is that you've led lots of groups. My wife and I were doing this together kind of as a couple without lots of other people that we didn't know. We didn't really have anybody that we knew outside of, our time together. Met a lot of people along the way. But, as you have worked with groups, what are some of the things that you've kind of stressed with respect to this question of intention and getting at the why, so to speak?
Well, thanks, Chris. It's a great question. And I almost feel like I want to ask Jenny, one of the pilgrims who's been on a pilgrimage with me, about this. But here's what I would say. We've learned over the years, I've learned, and the people I've co-led with over the years, we've learned we can't script a pilgrimage for people, but it's really about them finding their why, their intention, setting that intention, and then seeing where the path leads them. And it's very interesting. Some people, like you say, will come with a very strong sense of, I've retired and I want to live into this next season of my life. And I want to see where something of God might inform where my next steps are. Or it could be a new relationship or a breaking of a relationship that has caused something to happen. It could be the loss of a spouse or a loved one that's caused a time to say, life looks really different now, and I need a spaciousness to be with that and to walk with that. And but then we'll have pilgrims who will come on our pilgrimages to various places, and they'll say, I don't know why I'm doing this. There's some inner unknown impulse that says, but something tells me I need to do this. They may find an answer on the way, or they may not. And here's one example. I remember I was with a group of pilgrims in Iona, and one of the we try to craft experiences that are invitational, I'll say it that way, that invite exploration. And something we did on Iona that's different than what many groups do is we broke up the pilgrim group into many small B&Bs on the island, so that people were with maybe one or two other pilgrims. And at first, the pilgrims all looked at me and said, why are you doing this? We can't be together if we're scattered in the village. And of course, our intention was to have them enter into village life more closely and get to know locals. Well, it was really interesting. One of the houses that had guests was down the road, if you know Iona, south from the village, quite a ways. I want to say 3/4 of a mile. I know it doesn't sound far, but for the person who was away from everyone else in the village, it felt far away. And she came to me and said, well, I can't believe you have me walking all the way down there to have my room and then all the way back here. And I said, well, let's just see what's in this for you. I guess we were there for a week, and a couple of nights later, she comes to me, she goes, well, I know why we're here. And I said, I thought, I don't know why we're here. Why are we here? And she said, I stayed up late last night talking to our host, and I was still working through the process of being the caregiver for my mother in her dying last year. And I had not been finding peace. It turns out her host, that was the keeper at the inn, had been a retired hospice nurse. And he and she sat well into the night and shared reflections around that. And she said, I realize God is here and God is with me in this journey. And the gift was to be randomly placed in this house with this person. And I thought, what a beautiful way to find the why, right? She was doing deep work around her loss, and hadn't even articulated it to all of us. And so my experience in groups is that groups can give lots of ways for people to enter into that why and find their way. And you can imagine ages 15 to 82, there's a lot of different whys in those years. But it's really quite moving to see that. I think the other thing I would just comment on is many of the pilgrimages I've been leading are around walking. And I have a particular love these days for the Camino de Santiago, which are the many routes across Europe that invite pilgrims to make their way across and along these trails to Santiago de Compostela in northwest Spain. What I love about the practice of walking the Camino is it is a fully integrative spiritual practice of body, mind, and spirit. And that gets at another angle of this intention and the questions of what is possible for me. We may hide one of those parts of ourselves from our consciousness sometimes, but the Camino is pretty relentless in bringing all three to the fore and inviting that work of, I'd call it integration, spiritual wellness integration. And so that's been my experience when I think about the why. And I think it gets at this issue of, as we're just about to leave on a pilgrimage, I think it's 2 weeks from yesterday, our next Camino group is going to depart for Portugal. And we'll be walking over 10 days, 140 miles north through Portugal into Spain and then on to Santiago. And in conversations with our pilgrims, mostly those who have not made a Camino before are saying, I don't know if I can do these mileages each day. I had one yesterday call me and say, do you know 30 kilometers, how many miles that is? And I said, I do know how many miles that is, and it's hard. But there's that sense of vulnerability that comes out when we're setting out, they're preparing to set off. That sense of, we don't know how difficult it's going to be. Yeah. We don't know what's going to come up in front of our path. We don't know how our body will react, our spirit will react, our mind will react to what's going on. And so we may feel a tremendous need for support, for care, for blessing. And maybe we have that profound need to put ourselves under the protective and guiding hand of God. So I think it's really a powerful time for people when they're embarking on an adventure and don't even know what it is yet. And I think in that way, there's a sense of recovering the sense of adventure in our journey of life and faith, which we get so caught up in just carrying it out day to day, we forget that this is a great adventure. And I think that's something I really love about pilgrimage.
Thank you. Can I follow up with that a little bit? I just you're bringing to mind some memories here that and really some feelings and emotions, I guess, because it was a year ago that CJ and I embarked on the first journey that we took, which was a pilgrimage along the border of England, Scotland to the holy island of Lindisfarne. And so I had met CJ at the airport in London. I'd been there for a few days visiting friends beforehand. We made our way to the beginning, really. After a couple of days in Edinburgh, we made our way to a little village called Galashiels, which was just a typical quaint sort of Scottish English village. But I remember the sense of almost, not foreboding, that's a little too strong, but the sense of apprehension there was like, oh, here we are. We've been preparing for this for so long here. We don't exactly know what it's going to be like. We've projected in our minds what our expectations are there, but there's so much of the unknown. We've seen the pictures of the first hill we have to climb. What will that be like, and so forth. And just that night before we began, and I don't know if other folks who've done pilgrimage can relate to this, and so on, please chime in. But that sense that night before of okay, it's almost like the mission is about to start. We're counting down 10, 9, 8, 7. Let's get a good night's sleep here, and then sort of launch out. And I think that letting go and then entrusting oneself to to God's care and provision is a practice of our spiritual life. And when it's actually done in the context of, I know what my supports are back home, but I don't know what my supports are going to be here on this road, really puts that out there in a testable sort of way, if you will. And I found that quite interesting now as I reflect back on it. Thank you for kind of bringing that to my mind as we were talking about that.
Well, I love hearing. I go to Lindisfarne in my mind as you tell that story. But it also makes me think about every time we go on pilgrimage, even after having gone on many pilgrimages, we still go through that setting out stage. And here I am now. This will be the 7th group Camino I have led. And I came off a sabbatical this summer. I was strong and healthy, centered. Everything was great. I came back to work and I'm looking at Nancy Jones. I'm in a Zoom with Nancy Jones and I'm getting chills. I often get chills from Nancy Jones, but it turned out I had COVID. This was the week after I got back. And I thought, I can't have COVID 6 weeks before a pilgrimage. This is not a good idea. And thankfully, it was a mild case and I'm recovered. But even now, what that's done is it's affecting perhaps all three: my physical preparation. It's definitely working on my mind game because I'm wondering what I'm capable of. And definitely those both feed into my spiritual journey. God, what do you have for me in this pilgrimage? And so here I go on a 7th Camino, and it will be like no other. And it's still bringing up these same questions, these same impulses, the same uncertainty that is so common for all of us at the beginning of a pilgrimage. So I'm kind of marveling at that here it is. And so, Chris, I wonder, how do you deal with managing or setting or managing expectations around pilgrimage? Because that's tied up in this also, isn't it?
It is tied up into it. And I think, there's a distinction between your intentions and your expectations. So both of those are really key to be thinking about if you're planning a pilgrimage. We talked about the intentions being the why. The expectations are more about how you project it will be. And it kind of gets down to some basic kinds of things. I want this to be a mountaintop spiritual experience. I expect this to be life-changing, or I don't have a lot of expectations. I really just don't know what to think about it. And so I think that expectation part is really known in the unfolding of the actual journey and the walking itself. We might go for, the interior work that we aim for, time to discover something about myself, my faith, my relationship, my connections to God's creation. And we want to have the expectation that will unfold. But then sometimes we get in the middle of it and we find that this isn't the journey that we expected. We're not given as pilgrims any particular guarantee that the weather is going to cooperate for us, that our feet won't succumb to hot spots or blisters, that the albergue we stay in is going to be bed bug free, or that our nutritional desires or expectations will be fulfilled. We kind of, can think about those things that we have kind of joked about since we've been back from doing pilgrimages. And I think too that as far as expectations are concerned, it's good for us not to neglect that the dimension of a pilgrimage that is social in nature. And what I mean by that is, I think a lot of us may go with this sort of set of personal intentions, or even, if you go with a couple or a spouse or a partner along the way, you might have a particular set of, relationships to work on in there as far as your expectations and so on. But I think the one thing that the pilgrimage does is it kind of throws you together with lots and lots of other people, and the potential for engaging that cohort that you're with in a very kind of fluid way, because it can change throughout the day, it can change over the course of a week, but to really be thinking about some expectations you have around the social work of being part of a pilgrimage along the way. What am I discovering as I interact with strangers, and how much self-revelation do I want to disclose? What do I hold back from others? What am I fearful of? How am I on the pilgrimage different from how I am at home? Is there something that God is doing through other people? Because there's a social dimension to pilgrimage. Is God doing something through other people to ask me to change in a way? Or am I to be used by God to be a blessing to somebody else, to be a listening ear to the person who has gone through a breakup or a job disappointment or a medical condition? How can I be a servant in a way to the other pilgrims who are walking along the way? I mean, that thought really didn't cross my mind until I actually was on it. So I think intentions and expectations are two different things. But I would just encourage people to be open to kind of really reflecting on the moment itself and really being present in the moment itself. So anyway, lots of words there, but that's kind of how I would think about that. Do you have some thoughts, Greg?
I do. I love this idea of social work, because I think of pilgrimage as inherently individual and completely communal at the same time. We're doing our inner work, our solitary work, but we're with other people. And me with my stories, I have a story I remember of another person that I met on my first, one of my first Caminos. I was walking one day with a rabbi friend of mine. She was on our trip, and we were having a great conversation. We stopped at a little cafe on the Camino for coffee, and we're sitting, discovered a couple of our other pilgrims there, and we were sitting having a conversation. And then this man joined us at the table that we didn't know. And we kind of looked and thought, what's his story? His name was Jens. And we started to talk to him a little bit. And he was just a really kind, wonderful person. But we didn't spend a lot of time there. And we started to get up after maybe a 10-minute conversation. And as we started to get up ready, kind of got our packs back on and got back out on the trail, the rabbi turned to me and she said, he wants to walk with you. And I said, I have a feeling he wants to talk about something. And she goes, I got that same feeling. And but he walked on. And so we thought, well, I guess we'll never know. And then, so we walk on. It was still pretty early in the day. About an hour later, he's on the side of the road peeling the layers as it's getting warmer. And I say hello again and kind of a brief interaction. By then, the rabbi and I had kind of found that we were walking at different paces, so we weren't together anymore. I was alone. And but he didn't really engage me. And so I just kept walking. Well, you could imagine a half hour later, I needed to peel layers, and I was on the side of the trail, and he came by again. This is now the third meeting. And I said hello again, and he kind of looked at me, and I said, would you like to walk together? And he said yes. And we started walking, and he said nothing. And I thought, what is this? What is he wanting or needing, or what's going on here? It felt needed to be with him in this social kind of moment, in this connected moment. And finally, I asked the question pilgrims often will ask, getting back at that intention, what brings you on the Camino? And he says to me, well, And he was very silent. And then after a while, he said, I will tell you. And then long silence, long silence. And he said nothing. He said, 7 years ago, my youngest son, who was 12, was hit by a drunk driver as a pedestrian and was killed.
Mm.
And it was devastating for me, for my wife, for our family. And we've carried that with us for these years. And then he kind of went silent. And I just said, I'm so sorry. I didn't know what to say to this. And then he said, 1 year ago, my older son, who was 19, committed suicide because he had never had peace with his younger brother's death.
Hmm.
And he said, and then in the years since that has happened, I might be getting my dates wrong, but the dates, my wife has been diagnosed with breast cancer. And he looked at me and he had just tears in his eyes. And he says, I've come on the Camino to find peace. And while he's carrying all of this, this grief, this loss, this weight, and we just walked a long way in silence without any words. Later in the walk, we walked all the way to the end of the next phase, we call it, or stage, to the next village. And as we're getting close to the village, we hadn't talked much at all. And I finally asked him, I said, do you have a tradition that you come from? And he said, well, he was German. I have a weakness for Germans, it turns out. But he said, you won't understand this. He said, it's kind of something unique. He said, I am spiritual, but not religious. And I looked at him and I said, that's the largest group in the United States. I said, I completely understand what you're talking about. We exchanged information. We're still in touch these years later. But it reminded me that there's this community of people on pilgrimage all around us who are right there doing their work while we do our work and yearning for the connection sometimes. And I think there's, I guess, the aspect of social work, and you mentioned this a little, Chris, sometimes we're willing to reveal to someone who's not connected to home, who's not a part of our story, a part of our story that we're carrying that we don't have space to process, to just voice. He didn't need me to do anything except listen that day. And it was a good lesson for me of what it is to find those spaces where we can just be with each other, present, I guess you'd say, or just, and caring. And so I think in pilgrimage, that's one of the essential qualities. And I think the gift of pilgrimage is that you often will meet pilgrims who may not have the same intention, but it's a little bit self-selected. It's people who've decided they're going to embark on deeper work in their life. And even though it may be different things they're working on, that's my sense is that comes into play.
Yeah, I just another quick story on this, if you would. It brings to mind, the last day or so before I entered into Santiago, I was hiking or walking by myself, and CJ had taken a cab into Santiago, and so it was raining and pretty muddy and so forth. But I'm a pretty fast hiker, and I tend to kind of want to get around people, not to ignore or miss being present. So I didn't want to be that obnoxious hiker who's constantly speeding up and so forth. But I tend to that's just how I do it, but I was walking behind a family. They were from the US, I could tell by the way they were speaking, US or Canada. And it was about 5 or 6 people in this family, and a Catholic family. And the mother was reciting the rosary for the entire family as they were walking along. And rather than pass them by, for me right now at that particular moment, to listen to those prayers and to be able to attend to what they were sharing without really knowing that I was 15 or 20 feet behind them, but listening in was a huge blessing in a way. Their example and their piety and so on, it really kind of spoke to me in that moment. And as eventually I did walk ahead, but I thank them for allowing me. I sort of said, you didn't know this, but I was listening in, and your prayers blessed me today. And I just want to thank you for sharing those. And it was a particularly poignant moment for me along the way. So, yeah.
That's really beautiful. It reminds me of the quote I like to share from St. Augustine, and that is "Solvitur ambulando," which in English means it is solved by walking. And so I think these stories we are sharing remind me that walking itself, either by ourselves or with another person, is really a spiritual discipline. It's a contemplative practice that gives us space and maybe the ability to release what's stored in our bodies and allowing that stuff to come up, and maybe inviting that question, what's my work to do in this day, in this time, perhaps in this season or place? What is it I'm called to do in my life? And so it strikes me these stories really bring that alive.
Yeah, definitely. Thank you. Can I jump down to talk a little bit about some practical things like being flexible?
Yes, I think that's essential.
You've had 7 different pilgrimages around the whole topic of flexibility. What are some of the things that you have experienced and learned that would be helpful for us to know about?
First of all, no two are alike. One of the things, we give a packing list to our pilgrims beforehand and try to anticipate what people might need, telling them to bring as little as possible, but everything they need. How's that for a conundrum? And but we don't have an ability to manage certain things, right? So we tell people to bring rain gear, and then it doesn't rain. Or people haven't brought their rain gear and it rains the whole time. There are trails that vary widely when we're on the Camino, particularly. This is true in other places as well. I mean, I think of the Pilgrim's Walk at Lindisfarne. The Pilgrim's Way it looks simple enough until you're in it and you're up to your ankles in mud. Suddenly it feels a lot different. And so there's things like, where will we sleep? Where will we stay? What will we eat? What happens if I get hurt? And people worry about their ankles and their knees and their hips. And I can tell you those things are important, those parts of the body, but it's the blisters that get people. This tiny little blister in the bottom of the foot can really, really be difficult. To me, this is getting at, and Chris, you and I have talked about this. This is kind of my take on when I think of scripture and I think of the Bible and these collections of these unbelievable sacred stories that we have. To me, it's a series of stories from ancient times that talk about what does it look like to trust in God when things don't go the way we think they should go. We saw that in the Hebrew people all the way through. It's not about walking away, but how do we walk in faith? So to me, being ready for anything calls for nothing but flexibility and openness to the possibility of what that can be. If I'm going to walk all day today in the rain, what will it be that I can consider? What is it? And so it's still an invitation as far as I can tell. What's your reaction when I say that about flexibility from your experience?
Well, yeah, so I had a physical condition that developed before I started on the pilgrimage, and that was very difficult to bring with me. It was an ankle issue. I didn't know this at the time, but I had torn some of my tendons in a vertical tear beforehand, and so I went over, having done some walking in Colorado before the pilgrimage started, and I had to wear a brace the entire time I was there, and for 6 weeks it was painful. It was very painful. So and yet at the same time, God was speaking to me, through that. My expectations had to be adjusted a little bit downward in terms of what I was physically capable of doing. And it just kind of opened to me the sense of dependence upon God and God's strength for me to be able to participate in this. Not to feel sorry for myself, although I did sometimes. And that continues on because I still haven't quite healed from that as well. And although things are much, much better in the year since, this is an injury that takes a long time to kind of be reconciled. And so, I've kind of come to a place of just kind of accepting that I may have this issue for the rest of my life in a way. It may not be as painful as it was, God willing, it's not as it was on the pilgrimage, but something that I have to live with there. And it's entirely my fault because I didn't want to go to the doctor and have the doctor tell me don't go on the pilgrimage. So I was kind of stubborn in that regard, but it's been something of an opportunity for some spiritual growth and reflection, having to deal with that particular issue during that time. So
I can imagine.
Flexibility. Well, it's not something I am easily come to, but yeah.
Well, and maybe the underlying shadow for you, for me, for all of us is that sense of flexibility calls us to let go of that thing that we may or may not think we sometimes rely on, and that is the need for control, right? And I think pilgrimage is a practice that invites us to let go of that. We all have various control needs, and I think, how do we let go of that in a way that's safe and that allows us to go to the deeper reflection around it? And I guess I'm struck, Chris, as you talk about that injury. So often we talk about sports injuries and things like that in a very kind of secular, this is what I had to do to get it healed. I had this many weeks of PT. But I guess I'm struck to notice how it started to cause you to go to a deeper reflection about this. And maybe that's the opportunity that pilgrimage brings, is it has us. We still do those other things, but the meaning is the important part that starts coming in.
What does it mean to walk with a limp?
Exactly.
Physically and emotionally and spiritually, I mean, the physical part might heal, or it may not completely heal. But to walk with a limp is something I think that comes out in Scripture time and time again. And we're all walking with limps of one kind or another, right, in our lives. And
absolutely,
for me, this kind of opened up that empathy and, I hope, solidarity with other people in my life who may be carrying different kinds of limps. But it kind of helped me to, I think, enter into that a little bit more. So not that I was seeking that, but that's kind of what happened.
Absolutely. I wonder, we talked about, I'm going to jump a little further on ahead as well and just say, it strikes me as we talk about all this that it kind of gets at this issue we were conscious of as we were talking about preparing this. Pilgrimage can take many forms. We've been talking a lot about pilgrimages to Santiago or to Lindisfarne or Iona, and certainly those are well-known and well-traveled pilgrimage paths worldwide in the Christian tradition. But it strikes me that pilgrimages can take many forms. In distance, we said this at the outset briefly, what a path might look like, what terrain might look like. It also might look different depending on our abilities, what limitations we may have. If we have physical impairments from an injury or from our condition, perhaps we don't have budget to travel so very far away. Or we have household or family obligations that keep us close to home. How can we start to think about a pilgrimage that's more tailored to that reality so that it's manageable by location, budget, distance, duration, all those kind of practical things? Chris, I'm wondering, how do you react to me thinking those terms?
Yeah, no, that's great. And that gets really at the heart of what you and I wanted to do today, was sketch out possibilities that are, accessible to as many people as possible, right? And so you've named a lot of things that I think are the potential barriers for doing something like the big going overseas and so on. there are, I think, and the sky's kind of the limit, I think, but I think there are some really good things that can be done in this regard. And one of the things I just want to suggest is this summer we had the opportunity, 3 churches in the Denver area, Epiphany, Christ Church, and St. Gabe's, embarked on a common collaboration around the Holy Spirit, the person and work of the Holy Spirit. So it was kind of like a long meditation on Pentecost and the person and work of the Holy Spirit. One of the things that I brought to the table was a suggestion that we spend time as communities praying for the neighborhoods in which we find ourselves situated. Epiphany is up on Colorado Boulevard and 100 Colorado Boulevard, First in Colorado. Christ Church is on University, and St. Gabe's is over here in Inglewood, Cherry Hills. Each have their own neighborhoods surrounding them. How is it that we could be taking a walk from one church to the other and spend time with people from all these churches, spending time praying for the needs of the neighborhoods, praying for, as we walk by a school, pray for the elementary school or the teachers and families as they were preparing, this was in August, to come back to school. As we pass by businesses, to reflect and pray for the occupants of office buildings, recreationers out walking or jogging, and just thinking about that. We also had an opportunity to pass by a water treatment facility and to give thanks for the infrastructure that we so often take for granted, and to really thank God for the people who work in those dimensions of our life that allow us to have fresh water to drink out of a tap when so much of the world doesn't have that. So we did this over 2 Saturdays. The first Saturday we walked from Epiphany to Christ Church, and the second Saturday we did later in the month, we walked from Christ Church to St. Gabriel's. Each time we had about 10 to 15 people, and we celebrated a simple communion service at the end of each time. And the whole nature of the pilgrimage that I experienced when I was walking over in Spain was kind of captured in this miniature way by the fluidity of people talking to each other, getting to know people they didn't know, spending time around just building relationship, even just walking silently by yourself as well. So that's just one kind of model that I wanted to bring forward here. And but I'm sure there are others too as well, just in terms of gathering with 2 or 3 people and walking around your garden, or taking a walk in an open space near your house. Things can be, and people for whom mobility is a concern. Maybe it's mapping out, connecting, addresses and where people are at in your life, and kind of mapping out a imaginative journey to them, and how you might participate in their life or they in yours, by sending them a card or what have you, and kind of sketching that out. So just some thoughts and suggestions, and kind of wanted to share some of that, and just ask if you had anything else that you'd like to share too as well.
Well, I just would share the story of this summer on my sabbatical. I was with Henry, and we were in the North Sea region of Germany, which is where his family comes from. And we were visiting the village where his mother's side of the family came from, and had visited the graveyard where his grandparents were. And then we went into the church to sit and pray for a while. And as we walked in, we saw something called, what will I call it? The Pilgerweg Wanger Ländischer. And what had happened is 14 churches in this small little region, ecumenically diverse churches, had come together to create a pilgrim path through the village churches of this area, kind of the neighborhood churches, you would say, that you could either walk or bike between, and learn about the history of the area, the history of the church, the spirituality, and be invited in. And they had a pilgrim passport that they created. They had stamps you could stamp. but there were always in every church, and it caused us to start visiting all the churches. And we'd see promoting, tonight there's going to be a music recital in the church for pilgrims on the way. And different things were happening that built community. And what was interesting to me, I found it to be beautiful and inspiring to do this. Henry turned to me, who had been coming to this area his whole life, and said, I didn't know anything about these churches or these communities. This is opening up a whole new world for me. And I immediately thought, wow, I could picture neighborhoods or clusters of our churches and their neighbors doing something like this. And it really inspired me, actually. I thought, what a great idea. And a great sense of welcome from all those churches.
So each church had its own like stamp that they would have available for you to stamp your sort of pilgrim passport. Is that right?
Absolutely. Yeah. Everyone had a stamp that was based on some symbol of their parish. That's right. It was really something else. So just like as if you were in Spain, and it's not really connected to the Camino in Spain, but they were clearly inspired by the idea and made it their own, so that you could make this walk between the churches and villages through right on the edge of the North Sea.
That's great. Good ideas.
Yeah, absolutely.
I wonder if anyone has, if I could ask, does anybody have any particular thoughts on this particular topic here about making pilgrimage accessible?
Well, I went on the virtual pilgrimage that the diocese did in 2021, and it was wonderful. I mean, I was all by myself, and it was the middle of COVID, and I discovered I went to a different place within 5 miles of Longmont every day of this pilgrimage, discovered wonderful places to walk, and had a really nice time in prayer. It was really nice, even though it was just here in Longmont, and there were so many places. I thought I'll run out of places after a few days now.
You really get to, I'm sorry, go ahead.
And in Austria, there are pilgrimage churches everywhere, and groups from churches doing pilgrimages all the time. You see them everywhere. Austrians like to walk. They got a beautiful place like we do.
I'd love to touch base with you, because I'd love to do something like that. If another opportunity comes up to be able to do that in Austria, it'd be awesome, I think. Yeah. We talk a lot about people being hungry for pilgrimage, walking in pilgrimage as a spiritual exercise, to unplug. And if anything, I think going back to COVID, you mentioned COVID. I think if anything, COVID kind of told us of our own fragility and contingency, if you will, and our own, I guess, dependency in ways that we hadn't experienced before. And so many folks have kind of come to pilgrimage, I think, post-COVID, out of kind of something built in as a need they have to wrestle with all of that. And I don't know how long that'll continue, but it seems to be what we experienced in 2020, 2021, 2022 will probably leave a pretty long-lasting mark on many people for many different reasons. And I think pilgrimage allows a way for us to, even just locally, as you said, Longmont, Centennial, Grand Junction, wherever, to kind of get out and maybe do that interior work and that social work each time we have a chance to do that. Thank you.
We were going to think about how we might invite some conversation in smaller groups, but we don't have such a big group. I wonder if we could just invite responses as a total group. Mm-hmm. If you have thoughts that have been stirred, ideas that have maybe you're starting to find yourself mulling, or questions you have, I wonder if you could share those with us. We'd love to hear from you and hear what this has stirred in you.
Well, on a very practical level for me, because that's what kind of person I am, the fact that you started with, You don't have to go to the Camino to go on a pilgrimage. And I know that at the most basic level. But so I think if it stirred anything, it stirred the idea of how can I create pilgrimage? I mean, I'm walking all the time, but how can I create pilgrimage here? Whether it's a group or it's, I mean, we're in Colorado, so for people that can't fly to Spain. And then on the other side, I like that you address some of because I very much want to join a Camino pilgrimage at some point, but I'm intimidated by the distances. And that's just the honest to goodness truth. I mean, I walk all the time, but not 20 miles. And usually not even more than 10. So it's the fact that you said we're going to do 140 miles in 10 days. I can do the math. And I know that there's some days that have more than so I mean, I'm glad you addressed that a little bit. And Greg and I have talked about this a little bit, but that is really, I don't know. I don't know. And so maybe if I didn't feel like I could do the 20 plus miles, I find something that replaces that and I still get the experience.
Absolutely. Well, and I think, Nancy, you named something that for pilgrims we all face. Here I am going off on my 7th Camino, and I wonder, can I do it? Can I do these distances? And I think, well, I've done it 6 times. You would think I would have confidence that I can do it. But then COVID comes along. So there's always something that kind of enters into the picture to say, I think that's such a human aspect that comes into this that we have to be with. And as Episcopalians, we aren't always quick to go to that place, I think. We're pretty good about kind of putting up a little bit of a shield that says, I'm okay. And maybe that's part of what I love about pilgrimage as well, as it helps us kind of break that open a little bit. Thank you for sharing that, Nancy. Other things that came up for you that were stirred. I'm curious, Jenny, you're a pilgrim. I've witnessed you as a pilgrim. I'm curious if anything from today has resonated for you, or if you have questions, comments.
Well, hi, I'm Jenny, and I'm from St. John's Cathedral, and I went on a Camino with Greg in the fall of 19, so almost 4 years ago. It's just been delightful to be together because it's just brought back a lot of different memories of that experience. But what I've been kind of aware of as we've been together this afternoon is what happens after the Camino, and just the continued growth and reflection. And you all were talking some about kind of the social aspect. And I think it's fair in some ways to say the Camino group that we had was pretty magical. There was something about the group of people that, magically were gathered, and there just was a really nice connection. And I've just been reflecting over the last 4 years, those different some of those relationships have continued to grow. And I'm sure, for me, there's certain people that my relationship has grown with, and I'm sure there are other people on the Camino whose relationships have grown. So it just becomes this huge kind of exponential connections. But the thing that is also really poignant is that we have a gentleman that was on our Camino that has recently been diagnosed with ALS, and it's a very rapid progression. And the other day, he and I and another friend from the pilgrimage were at the Botanic Gardens together having lunch. And now I can frame it like we did a pilgrimage in the gardens, because what we did was he wasn't going to be able to walk around the gardens. And so we traded in his walker for a wheelchair, and we walked around the garden, the 3 of us. And so it was a very, now I see it as we were doing a pilgrimage. And we were also laughing, quite honestly, because you don't realize how hilly the Botanic Gardens are. You think they're kind of flat, but when you start pushing, a larger person around the gardens, it's like, whoa, there's hills here. So, but just some of that delight and magic, and how we continue to share life and share both life's challenges and joys.
Thank you, Jenny.
If I may, as host, let you know that we have about 9 minutes left, and as participant, because I am new to understanding pilgrimages, I echo what Nancy said, the idea of an accessibility, and I just will say ditto to everything Nancy said, and then add in, it strikes me as a wonderful outreach possibility. I know St. Bridget has a labyrinth, and we have had people that came to St. Bridget because they heard of the labyrinth. I don't even know in what publication or what manner. So I would be drawn to something like a pilgrimage, an accessible one, that might draw me in. So I'm sure I'm not alone in that. And now I leave you with 7 minutes.
Thank you. Thank you, Kirsten. Yeah, there's two practices that kind of have some similarities to them and yet some differences as well. So to be able to participate in both is kind of special to think about. What I perceive when I think of labyrinth is a pretty maybe solitary or interior journey, at least in my experience. And a Camino or a pilgrimage, use that language, can be that way. But there's also a social dimension to that. Of course, there is when you're on a labyrinth with other people, the communities there. Yeah, so scratch what I just said, but I think it is kind of fun to play with some of the differences or similarities too as well.
So when I come back to Chris, I keep thinking about that phrase. Sometimes I'll say to the pilgrims while we're making the journey, and that is, are we talking about the Camino or pilgrimage, or are we talking about life? And it usually is that we're talking about life. And so the Camino and pilgrimage become a great metaphor, a great invitation, again, to enter into reflection about our lives, right? Our own individual lives and our lives together, and the lives of those around us.
Even when the conversation's about blisters.
It's remarkably
Absolutely.
bonding what blisters can bring, I can tell you.
Shared empathy.
Mm-hmm.
And one thing I would want to just to bring out too, Greg, you've often said to me, and I've just kind of want to offer this for everyone, that there is a saying that the Camino begins to use the language of Santiago in Spain, but the Camino or the pilgrimage begins once you have reached what you thought was your destination of Santiago de Compostela and the cathedral there, that it actually begins from that point. It always reminds me of Cursillo and the fourth day
Yes,
as well. So, yeah.
absolutely.
If I may ask, perhaps for the group, so where would one start if they wanted to start exploring participating in a pilgrimage?
Greg, you want to start with that and respond?
That's a great question. And actually, I think in many ways where we wanted to come to conclusion, that is just to say, Chris and I want to make a pledge to you that if you feel compelled to explore what pilgrimage might mean for you or your community, and you're trying to think of creative ways that could happen, we'd love to help you with that. So we want to make ourselves available to you in conversation, either in person or on Zoom, whatever is easiest and workable, to help you discover what that might look like. We have a number of opportunities that come up from time to time through organized group. I think the next group that's being promoted across the diocese is a group going on in the footsteps of Paul in the spring in Greece. And so there's international pilgrimages. But I love the fact that St. Bridget's has a labyrinth. In my mind immediately to what would a pilgrim way visiting labyrinths of Episcopal churches in Colorado look like? And so it could look a lot of different ways, right? But we would love to be available to you to help you kind of find that creative answer to your question.
And piggybacking on that, just another piece is a couple of years ago for Lent or during Lent, we took a 2 buses of folks from St. Gabriel's down to San Luis and walk the Stations of the Cross outdoors there, in the San Luis Valley. That in itself was not billed as a pilgrimage, but it really did have the elements of that when we did that. So I'd say Stations of the Cross can also be built in, either just within your own congregation, if you have those, if that's part of your tradition, or even just making that up as you maybe sketch a route through your neighborhood, or along the Highline Canal in Denver, or wherever that might be, and maybe get 2 or 3 people to do that together. It can be special that way.
I had a great experience this summer on while I was here in Denver on my sabbatical, going up to the Mother Cabrini Shrine above Denver and walking the steps. I think it's 300 steps, and the stations that are connected to those. And you know, it's a Roman Catholic site, and I found it to be very inspiring, and it stayed with me that walk. So sometimes we don't have to go as far to find these opportunities as we might think.
Well, thank you all very much for listening in. And I know Greg and I have had a great time just prepping for today and having multiple conversations, and being with you as well. And look forward to interacting with you however you would like to do so. I think we're going to have a prayer at the end. Are we ready for that, Greg, do you think?
Yes, I have a closing prayer, and I would just say, Chris, I feel like I've made a pilgrimage with you just through this journey. I feel like we've met as we've walked along together, and I really love that feeling. And I look forward to continuing the conversations with you as well, and with all of everyone who's with us today. I want to share a prayer that actually we discovered in German in that North Sea cluster of churches on the back of their pilgrim booklet. And Chris has thankfully translated it into English, and it'll be our closing prayer. So let us pray. You, God of the beginnings, bless us when we hear your call, when your voice lures us to departure and new beginning. You, God of the beginnings, protect us when we let go and say goodbye, when we look back gratefully at what is behind us. You, God of beginnings, let your face shine over us when we take a new step on the path of our faith in trust and confidence. You, God of the beginnings, give us peace when our own path leads us upwards when we say goodbye. Let the flowers bloom for each of us. Let the wind strengthen our back, and let the sunshine warm our faces wherever we go. And you, God of the beginnings, bless us. Amen.
Amen.
Well, thank you, Chris and Greg, both very much. And they asked me to share with you all that this has been recorded, and it will be available on the convention website within 24 to 48 hours. And if you're interested in following the progress of convention, if you're not going, you can do that on the diocesan webpage, episcopalcolorado.org. And once you're on the homepage, you would go to the diocesan resources tab. And the pull down menu, you'll see the 136th annual convention, and click that and you'll be able to see the progress. Thank you everybody for coming and participating with us.
Thanks, Greg. Thanks,
Thank you
Chris.
very much.
Thank you very much. Take care.
Bye.